Okay, so we're going to start the webinar today. So greetings, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's joining, whether you're a seasoned diplomat, young leader, career public servant, or member of civil society interested in learning more about the landscape of the future of the Canadian diplomacy. So first of all, as part of our commitment to honoring and respecting the rights and cultural histories of Indigenous people of this land, we acknowledge that many are joining from the city of Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to immemorial time. We also recognize the attendees and panelists are joining from all across the country. So my name is Enya Bouchard. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer at Young Diplomats of Canada, and I'm also accompanied by my colleague Eunice Oledejo from Young Fellow from the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy. So we have the pleasure today of moderating the discussion. Both our organizations are delighted to co-host this panel webinar titled The Future of Canadian Diplomacy, Engaging Young Canadians in Civil Society, with stellar panelists who will bring different perspectives to the table. Topic covered during the webinar will include the foundational goals and roadmap for Canada's diplomatic transformation agenda, institutional and viewpoints to bridge the gap with policymakers, and best practices to incorporate the Canadian civil society and the future generation into the foreign policy making process. So the webinar structure will be as follows. First, we'll kick it off with a brief introduction of our panelists. Then the Global Affairs Canada representative will give his keynote speech. It will be followed by opening remarks from other panelists. And afterward, we'll jump into the moderated panel discussion with targeted questions to our panelists. And we'll end with a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them down in the Q&A box.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anya. So we're going to go into some brief introductions before getting into the rest of our agenda for today. I'm very delighted to be introducing our esteemed group of panelists today, and they're all very, very highly accomplished. I'll be doing brief introductions, but feel free to refer to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy's website for further information. So first we have Antoine Chevrier, who is the Chief Transformation Officer with Global Affairs Canada, and previously has served as Director General for Pan-African Affairs and subsequently Assistant Deputy Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Privy Council Office. Next, we have Louise Blais, who is a former ambassador and currently an associate with the Pendleton Group and Special Senior Advisor of International Affairs for the Business Council of Canada and QG100 in Quebec. She was previously Canada's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York, and as a senior diplomat has served abroad in Washington and Tokyo, and as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the Embassy in Paris. Next, we have Christina Cauet, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Young Diplomats of Canada and currently works as a Senior Policy Analyst at Natural Resources Canada. She's previously worked for international affairs teams across Global Affairs Canada and Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. Last but certainly not least, we have Anne Fitzgerald, who is the director at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and also a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. She has worked at the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, NATO headquarters, and the North Atlantic Assembly, and has also helped facilitate internationally on various sponsored peace talks and national security strategies. So a very big and warm welcome to our panelists. And now we're going to pass it over to Antoine, who's going to start us off with his opening remarks. Antoine, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Eunice. Thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to see Louise and Christina and on the screen as well, and the other participants. And speaking to you from 125 Sussex in the traditional unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Of course, we have a diverse network in global affairs, and this is a point of reflection for all of us, wherever we are, both in Canada as well as abroad. So it's important to start acknowledging this. And also starting, and I certainly would not use the 10 minutes of time. And I'm always a bit kind of, when I see keynote speech, it just sounds too big. So I'm gonna convert a keynote speech in some maybe intro remarks. It feels less consequential, but happy to share some thoughts. First, as to why the transformation effort, and I will not go to all the background. I'm sure that in some of the material that you've seen, and some of that information is readily available in public about the future of diplomacy discussion paper, the transformation implementation plan, but I'm going to guide you and point you and the participants in that direction of finding more information on those two very important documents that really underpin the transformation efforts in Global Affairs Canada, and it offers some ideas of the different pillars. And I really don't want to go in all the details of the different pillars and the 88 different deliverables of the transformation implementation plan, but I'll touch on a couple at the intersection of the transformation and the subject of the conversation, which is also engaging kind of young Canadians as well as civil society. But maybe a couple of considerations as to why kind of transformation. And I see I'm sure there are multiple reasons. I'm looking forward to the panel conversation on that. But why is context and the current context? And the context right now is not the same context as 5 years ago. We can discuss that in all its different nuances. But the context has changed. The circumstances globally have changed, and it's asking us, it's interrogating us as a foreign service, as a global affairs department, about, are we fit for purpose in that particular context? Have we developed the flexibility and the adjustment capacity to meet some of those challenges, be them geographic or thematic or process-wise? And it's not, we're not reinventing the wheel. What is really striking when I'm talking to counterparts in different foreign services, and what's interesting is if you talk to like-minded foreign affairs ministry around the globe, not all departments are created equal. Not all of them have the same remit as we do in global affairs, which really amalgamates 10 years after the creation of global affairs, the different streams of work of our international presence, but all of them are facing some of the same challenges that are being crystallized in the future of diplomacy discussion paper and the TIP, or the transformation implementation plan. Last week, I was talking to my German colleagues, and we've talked about how we support our workforce in changing times in an increasingly fragile world, and when we need to post diplomats in RCHIP and more RCHIP places. How do you harness the potential of AI and emerging tech while being mindful of the challenges and the importance, as we're a custodian of information, including private information of our colleagues, as mindful of some of those challenges? How do we actually, in a context of a world that is changing, with other pressure points, how do we readjust our presence abroad? And by readjusting our presence abroad, it's only bricks and mortar, kind of which embassies do we open where, but how we kind of change the nature sometimes. It's only the where, but the how. And we're all struggling with the same challenges. So context has evolved. We're all facing that in different ways. And part of the success of our collective effort from a collective of like-minded partners is sharing notes within ourselves, but also with our broader communities, with academic institutions in Canada, with civil society, and with groups, so that we're making the better choices. Now, the second reason why we need to transform is we've not transformed enough. I've got enough years in this department to talk from a bit of experience, including my postings abroad. But we're a department that has really, if you look at it, even 10 years after amalgamation in 2013, has not changed significantly, both in terms of structure, governance, processes. We remain a fairly vertical-driven organization, quite siloed in many ways. So some of the key driving forces of our department have not evolved as much as it should, or it should have. And in a way, if we would have developed that constant transformation adjustment function over the past years, I would not have this job, and I would not have this title of a Chief Transformation Officer in the team that's supporting me. Some people are on the screen as well, accompanying this session, because that will be part of the DNA of this organization. So we need to build that. So those are two key elements as to the why. Now, in terms of some of the how and the key components, again, I will not go to the five pillars and all the details of that, but there's natural points of, I would say, intersection with the nature of the conversation in the panel that we're having. One is the culture of the organizational culture. So I'm a big believer that what's going to drive the sustainability of the change and the transformation is really changing the organizational culture. We just published our North Star, which is going to drive us in terms of not explaining who we are, but how we go about our business. What are the values that drive us, the values of courage and of empathy and inclusion and so on. We need to live by that. And that's going to be the key success factor. And there are other elements of our culture that we need to go deeper on EDI, on official languages, on knowledge as a key underpinning. So that's going to be, and if you look at the transformation implementation plan, these are the key foundational driver horizontal that are key to the sustainability of the change. And then we have 4 key pillars. And some of those pillars are really kind of key in terms of the engagement with different communities is key, not only in Canada, but around the world. The Open Insights Hub is, of course, a natural point of intersection, not only in terms of how we engage different voices, but how we actually drive our policy as a result of that engagement, how we drive the analysis as a result of that engagement. And the open nature of it and the own networks that you have as participants are key, because it's not only open the doors of 125 Sussex and our different buildings to universities that are well known to us. It's also opening the doors to academic centers of expertise globally. To have conversation that include the largest number of voices possible for positions to be as informed as possible and as nuanced as possible. And as we look at the Open Insights Hub as a one key illustration of our open by default transformation, this leads us to some elements of the people pillar that we have in terms of ultimately how not only we support our colleagues that have joined us, that are with us, but how we offer a workplace that is going to be competitive in a very different labor market that was the case kind of when I joined CEDA at the time, and where people feel valued, where they feel engaged, where they feel that their voices are heard. So that's going to be extremely important, but also engaging with the same academic institutions to talk about policy. You can also discuss about what's the workforce of the future for global affairs? How will we develop training curriculum that will actually make sense for the university grads and for the people within global affairs? So there's a kind of a lot of points of intersection. I just wanted to offer some of those comments. We could talk, I'm sure, with Anne, because we've discussed that, the role of AI and cyber in emerging tech, not only in terms of the overall foreign policy, but how we utilize and harness those technology for a better department, a more efficient department. And some of our kind of younger demographic are early adopters of those tech, and we need to be able to harness that as well. And there's a range of other issues, but I'm going to leave that for the panel conversations and the Q&As. So thank you for the opportunity to engage.
Thank you so much, Antoine. And you said some really key things that I think will contribute well to our future discussion. So we're going to pass over now to our next 3 panelists to give us about a 5-minute speech from each of you. So we will get started now, and I'm going to pass it over to Christina.
Thank you, Eunice. My name is Christina Cowett, and I'm joining from Treaty 7 territory from my home in Calgary, Alberta today. I currently serve as CEO of the Young Diplomats of Canada, a nonpartisan, nonprofit, but notably youth-led organization that equips and empowers young leaders to contribute to and participate in global decision-making spaces. I'm proud to be one of 28 current volunteers with YDC, many of whom have contributed to the ideation and preparation of this panel co-hosted with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. YDC exists because we noticed there was a gap where policymaking and discussions happening at the global level were not always trickling down to Canadian youth. And vice versa, there weren't always many opportunities for young people to get involved in the conversations taking place. Since 2014, YDC has sent over 300 delegates to various multilateral fora, including the Youth 7 and Youth 20 summits, 2 official engagement groups under the G7 and G20. Speaking on behalf of the organization, the future of diplomacy matters to us, not only as individuals either studying or working in international affairs, but as a collective of youth from coast to coast to coast, passionate about Canada's future. The discussion paper begins by acknowledging that Canada is grappling with a shift in economic and political powers, and we've seen this from our global engagements at YDC. During my tenure as CEO, there was a time when an issue was brought to my attention by the Canadian delegates regarding the actions of a country with whom Canada did not currently have a strong relationship with. My advice as CEO was that it might be more, in fact, impactful if the Canadian delegates let a more geopolitically powerful country lead the change in expressing collective displeasure. I think it's unfortunate that was my instinct. There are many ways Canada can address this, from building a new policy expertise in areas critical to Canada's future, increasing our diplomatic presence abroad, as well as investing in GAC personnel. Today, I wish to highlight 2 ways that YDC is forwarding the recommendations of GAC's Future of Diplomacy discussion paper. The first is through our core programming of sending youth delegates to multilateral fora. While our operations began with the Youth 20 and the then Youth 8 Summit, 10 years ago, we expanded our programming to the World Bank Group and International Monetary Fund spring and annual meetings, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as the World Trade Organization Public Forum. YDC continues to be one, if not the only, Canadian youth delegation to attend some of these events. Through these delegations, we not only support the building of new expertise on international issues key to Canada's future, we further aim to maximize the use of soft power through cultural diplomacy and people-to-people exchanges. This leads me to what I believe is the second most impactful way YDC is forwarding the recommendations, which is focusing recruitment on underrepresented populations and wider geographic representation. This is something YDC is focused on for some time, as you recognize that if you don't see someone who looks like you may feel like there is not space for you. We want to acknowledge that providing equity of access has been challenging, as the majority of YDC's delegations are not funded by the organization. So while YDC applicants tend to identify as being part of a visible minority and the 2S LGBTQI+ community at a notably higher rate than the general population, Francophone applicants and applicants based in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, and the Prairies tend to be underrepresented compared to the Canadian population as a whole. We know that access to personal and professional development opportunities in international affairs can have a cumulative impact on which individuals are selected through hiring processes like GAC's Foreign Service Officer recruitment, for example, which is why this is an organizational priority. In sum, YDC recognizes that diplomacy is ultimately about relationships between countries, but those relationships are built by people. By investing in the future diplomacy, we believe Canada can increase its global influence when and where it matters most. This, in turn, can mean greater prosperity and security for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks, Christina, and we'll go over to Louise next.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
So we're having devices problems today. That usually doesn't happen. Well, I really want to thank YDC and the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for inviting me to be part of the conversation today. It really is an honor and a pleasure. It's wonderful already to have heard from Antoine and from Christina, two wonderful perspectives. I thought what I would bring to the table today, just to set things up, is a little bit just complimentary, I want to say. I wrote a piece, it was last September, around the time when Global Affairs Canada presented its transformation project. And I felt there was one thing that was missing, because I thought it was excellent overall, but I thought that it was important to set the transformation inside a very focused foreign policy. I wrote then that first and foremost, we needed to be pragmatic in our foreign policy. I don't know if it's an accident that the minister picked that up in November, but really made the point that it was important that we're practicing a diplomacy that is more closely tied to our interests and less on virtue signaling. I also called on the government to set clear priorities, both in policy objectives and in general activities. The transformation, I think, in its recommendation, obviously Antoine went over it very quickly, but it does talk about the ability to be nimble, to be able to change where the resources are allocated with this changing world. I think the proof will be in the pudding of that. That's a really difficult thing to do in the government, but I think it's absolutely essential. I often think and speak about the fact that Canada belongs to many more international organizations than most countries of similar size. We're spread really, really thin. It's positive that we're part of all the clubs like the G7 and G20 that many other countries our size are not privy to. But we take on all of those memberships without really reassessing the other ones that may be the legacy association that we should probably look at reevaluating, because resources are limited. And I note, of course, the transformation is asking for further investment, but in today's fiscal environment, that might be difficult. I also wanted to make the point that there are ways in which the transformation could also mean better burden sharing where it's possible. When I was at the UN, I really noted just how much the European Union, which has as its own separate delegation, which is an observer, but they conduct negotiations for all EU member states. So countries like France, larger than us, have that in where they are represented by this or by the EU. Canada does not have that. We often work closely with CANS, Australia and New Zealand, but really ultimately we are being asked to do a lot more than countries our size. So I think we really do need to bring things back to what is in our national interest and where can we truly affect change. And I think that is an exercise that would be very important to have complementary to the transformation. I think when we came out with the Indo-Pacific strategy, that was all wonderful and very well done, but how can you have an Indo-Pacific strategy if you don't have an overall foreign policy? And this is where I'm going to tie it back to youth and to the topic today. I think that in the absence of this consultation, pan-Canadian consultation on foreign policy, we have what we have now, a lot of misinformation and division in Canada vis-a-vis our foreign policy. I think what's happening in the Middle East is just one of those examples. I think we haven't done enough to really go around and consult Canadians on the kind of foreign policy they want. Now, it's clear that such a consultation is not going to mean that we're going to reflect every single point of view. We're going to have to make choices. But when you don't have the dialogue to begin with, you really are driving blind. I'll give you an example. When we were running the campaign for the Security Council, I was intimately involved in that exercise in the last one. It wasn't clear to me that Canadians really understood what was at stake. And it wasn't clear to me that Canadians were really backing the campaign. And we had all sorts of examples of that. And I think we didn't do enough, I think, to explain why that was important for Canada and where that fit in our foreign policy. And that's just an example. So I think as we transform the department, I think we also have to realize that we have to also do as much consultation as possible with Canadians. I think we also, and the last one I'm going to make is, I think transforming the department is key, and it's wonderful that it's happening. But I think we also need to transform the government. What I mean by that is there's a lot of other government departments that are involved in foreign policy today. ECCC, for example, in the environment, climate change, or you've got defense, you've got many others. And I think that there has to be a way in which Global Affairs Canada can truly be given the lead again in foreign policy. And that can only happen by collaboration with the central agencies and PCO, where Antoine was at, and having a sense that we're really all we're all rowing in the same direction. So I think I just want to applaud the work that Antoine is doing. And I just think our ambitions should be higher in terms of overall government approach to foreign policy and consultation with Canadians. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you, Louise, for your remarks. And we will go over to Anne now.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone out there in the audience today. I really support this initiative to begin with, and the comments of my co-panelists. Thank you, Antoine, for leading a very important exercise, I think, for Canada. And I can imagine what your desk looks like at the moment, but I think this is going in a positive direction. Let me respond to some of the questions that were put to us, one of which was, what did we think were some of the most pressing drivers for change that Global Affairs Canada must adjust to? I think generally speaking, I think it's important to recognize that the system that a country, a middle income economy like Canada signed up to, it was a multilateralist system. And multilateralism depends very much on the sanctity of a rules-based order. It depends on rules, right? Everybody playing by the rules. And what we have seen really go out the window over the last few years are those rules. And it's really a situation described by winner takes all geopolitics. And so it leaves middle-income countries like Canada quite vulnerable because there's no playbook, right? It's ill-defined and it's undefined. So I think that's something that we need to focus on. And what Canada, I only came back from Canada in late 2019, having had a career overseas and in a lot of conflict-affected developing countries for many years, but also in the UK. And I found myself at different international peace talk tables and national dialogue tables. And when there were Canadians in the room, it made a difference. It did make a difference. And where the difference was felt was with the knowledgeable and strong foreign service diplomats that Canada always had. But where the difference was also felt was the way in which Canadians at a table would try to strive for the highest common denominator, because we were used to convening in very diverse societal perspectives or contexts. And the other difference was that we emphasized human rights. And human rights is something that I find is very tangible. It is a very real thing to talk about. Sometimes ethics and other issues that relate to fairness and equality are a bit more philosophical. So I'm going to come back to the notion of human rights in a moment. But Canada was always seen as a country that really represented that file. And that's something I'm going to come back to as well. The second driver that I'd like to mention is that we are now working in an intangibles marketplace. We have been used to, for a very long time, and certainly my lifetime and all of your lifetime, working in a tangibles marketplace. So there's a different notion of capitalism here that we're dealing with. And I question the extent to which we have a policy orientation that is fit for purpose for an intangibles marketplace. So what I mean by an intangibles marketplace is that power depends on who owns and controls data and who owns and controls intellectual property. Those things are very important. And our resilience in the global system depends very much on it. So the question is, how do countries add value to the global supply chain? Because that's where countries gain resilience. And adding value these days is all about who puts ideas into an ideas marketplace for intangibles. You know, starting compounds for electric vehicles and heat pumps aren't going to do our economy a great deal of good, because we're importing other people's IP and other people's knowledge and other countries' patents. We need to develop the next BlackBerry. We need to develop the next Microsoft, the Apple, maybe hydro-powered cars, etc. So, because that's what others will rely on in the future, and that's what will bring value to an intangibles marketplace supply chain. Third thing that should be driving change is that there are new threat vectors that are impacting the country. And these threats include everything from access in our Arctic waters, an area that large swaths of which will be inhabitable in years to come, especially 20, 25 years to come, and on which others are probably keeping their eyes. Threats like TikTok algorithms, threats that could have a massive impact on the country. So unlike the first Cold War, and people are referring as the current time as the second Cold War, I would argue that we are dealing with enmeshment rather than a decoupled situation. And decoupling was very germane to the first Cold War. So moving forward, we need a combination of de-risking strategies and decoupling strategies. And it's very important to know exactly what the nature of those risks are in order to know what to de-risk against. So I'm really glad that Antoine raised some of the work that Global Affairs Canada is doing to bring other skill sets and knowledge to the table. I think international affairs has taken on a whole different meaning these days. It needs knowledge and skill sets from the STEM disciplines as much as from the social science and humanity disciplines. We have people, applicants for our programs now who are coming from mathematics, engineering, quantum sciences, all over. And I think it's very important to recognize that government has always played a role in rebalancing, right? We've got a curve that denotes the technology advancements, and then government catches up and brings policy and legislation to fit the current state of how society works. Well, we've seen a real swing upwards, and we're still racing to catch up. So it's not only important to have those skills and knowledge in place in the Foreign Service and in government ministries, as Louise quite rightly said, this needs to be whole of government. It is important to keep those knowledge and skill sets in Canada. And we're seeing a lot of brain drain these days. For many years we believed, and that's one of the reasons why I came back to Canada, I believed it's a great country to be in at the moment. But we're starting to lose people. We're starting to lose people who came here with big hopes, students that wanted a new direction and a good place to come to. And companies like Google and Facebook and OpenAI and Meta, they're all thanking Canada. Some of them have issued statements that publicly thank Canada for providing their senior leadership teams. So that takes us to the root of a lot of these things, and that is the higher education system in Canada. It's something that has always been strong. You can't get a bad degree anywhere in this country, but it is something that needs to be protected moving forward. It's also something that needs to come together with institutions like Global Affairs Canada. We have a mandate to do research. The policy community doesn't have the capacity. I mean, policy positions are not the same for the duration of a career, where academic research positions have that longitudinality that policy doesn't. So that really suggests strong relationships between academia and policy. Canada can also project its higher education establishments abroad and use them to develop good civil society partnerships. So our footprint to the ground doesn't necessarily have to do only with diplomats on the ground, but with other augmented capacity in Canada that can come together overseas. So I think I'll stop talking there, because I hope that's opened some areas where we could continue the discussion, have some good questions posed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And yes, definitely has opened up a lot of paths for discussion. So we are going to move over to our moderated panel discussion now. We'll direct the questions to some of you, but also feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. So Anya will be starting us off.
Thank you to all the panelists. As you can see, we have a diverse array of perspective, and I think that will be interesting to exchange among ourselves. Just to start it off, this question is mostly targeted to Antoine, but also Louise, based on your expertise, so feel free to jump in. We just wanted to know, how is the Global Affairs Canada's Transformation Initiative different from previous studies that have been made? For instance, the McDougall report in 1981, but even more recently, for instance, we can add the Senate report that was done on the challenge and rising to the challenge, empowering Canada Foreign Service. So if you want to speak a bit about that, and just to quote Louise, saying, why should Canadians care about it?
Okay, great question. I'll probably make a tie that kind of including based on Louise's question, and I'll tie it into the Senate report. So the Senate report was a good read, and of course, when you're in positions such as mine, you hear about the Senate study and a report, and then you open with some degree of trepidation, because you want to say, kind of, are we going in the right direction, or are we in the right ballpark? And it was a pretty, I was happy to read the Senate report, because if you look at it, and if you actually could do a bit of side-by-side between the Future of Diplomacy discussion paper, the TIP, the Transformation Implementation Plan, and the Senate report, there's not that much space, right, where well aligned in terms of the directionality, in terms of some of the conclusions. There's not that much disagreement, and I would say that I honestly, I don't see that much I don't see disagreement. I think there are nuances and there are things that belong to us as global affairs, as driving. But if you look at some of the Senate report, there are elements as to should global affairs be a separate employer, or should global affairs be crystallized as a central agency for the department? And these things are things that really is part of more of a common effort with other institutions. So I would say that in terms of the reading and the analysis that the senators did as part of the report, and of course they did that on the basis of multiple engagement, different sessions, travel to multiple places and engaging with partners who are doing some of the same analysis, they're taking into account the context and so on, we're well aligned. But one of the points that we've discussed quite a bit as a result of the Senate report is how we do need to strengthen our capacity and our reflexes and our approaches to actually tell the story of why does it matter to Canadians and to our different constituency even outside Canada. So I'm very proud of the department. We have great colleagues. We have great stories to tell, and I mean stories in terms of our capacity to respond to crisis, our capacity to lead the way on some key deliverables, to maintain relationships across the board. I've been posted 5 times abroad, so I quite a bit of appreciation for our colleagues abroad as well, and our locally engaged staff, which was one of the elements of the questions in the chat as well. But we need to up our game in terms of telling the story of why does it matter and what's our contribution. And this is something that I think that we typically as an institution, we tend to take this for granted, and we shouldn't. And this is really central to the conversation about how do we equip ourselves, and not only in terms of being able to answer to media requests or plan for some engagement of our leadership, but really to tread that narrative in a more sustained, consolidated way. So I think that this is part of I think the Senate report really crystallized that point. We're really mindful of that. This is something that we realize that this is something that we can continue to work on and do better at that. And the question as to why it's different this time around than other instances, including 10 years ago, I was working on the amalgamation when CEDA and ex-CEDA and ex-DFATE were brought together. And Louise was in the department at the time, and she'll remember that. And there are all sorts of been efforts before and somewhat after and all those. I would say that this time, and of course I'm biased, and part of it is, hey, I'm the chief transformation officer. I'm saying that my time is more important. It's not that. But there's a bit of a sense that there's a coalescing of voices, both inside and outside the department, as to the importance of change. And the level of constituency, both at the political expert level and even within the department, from people who are still within the department or people who have recently retired, it creates a space where the transformation can really be nurtured and sustained. Whereas in the past, some of those maybe other efforts were in different moments, maybe with a less of a broad constituency in terms of the need for a change. And of course, the events and the context has changed so dramatically over the past years that it really forces us, and I think provides a bit more additional support. So I would offer that as one piece of the equation to that broader question of why this is different right now than in the past.
Thank you, Antoine. Louise, do you want to add with your experience with global affairs throughout the years?
Yes, sorry. I do. I completely agree with everything that Antoine just said. I guess what I would add to it is, indeed, it's true. I think the department has been historically very reactive from a communications point of view. We tend to handle, response to the media, but there isn't a proactive communication campaign that many other government departments have. The government of transport, fisheries, they go on campaigns all the time to educate Canadians about this and that. Same with ECCC. So, but it hasn't been in the DNA of the department, that external communication with Canadians. So I think that's something that definitely needs to be developed. And I'll agree with Antoine as well to say that this is a bit different. And the reason why this timing is different is because the world is different. I think les Canadiens sont conscientisés de plus en plus. Canadians really realize, wow, what's happening across the world really has an impact at home. We just have to look south of the border, what's going on with the Americans and their election, and we know that some of those jolts might come our way. So I think there is a sense among Canadians now that foreign policy and our positioning internationally is fundamentally important, and how we go about doing it with our government, I think, is key. And so I think that helps. I think in the absence of that, I think it was kind of difficult. I mean, you see the same debate surrounding funding of the defense department of our military. You wouldn't have really have had any traction for that 5 years ago. But now all of a sudden, Canadians care. Canadians realize that this is a really troubled world, and we really need to invest in our capacity to protect ourselves. I think that's what the polls are showing. So there is a real opportunity right now, I think, to drive this home. And I'm constantly amazed, and it's not for a good reason, but all of a sudden there's all this focus on the UN, where because of all what's happening in the UN Security Council, what happened with the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine, the Middle East crisis, people are paying attention. Yes, you can say it's polarized, not working fast enough, but it's important. And there are conversations there that Canada is at that I think Canadians are realizing that they fundamentally matter to us. So I think the time is really propice for this kind of transformation.
Thank you, Louise. I do feel your and Antoine's perspective are aligned. I did see Anne raising a hand. Did you want to jump into having a more...
Yeah, I was just going to build on something Louise said, which I think is very, very important, is to see the reaction to the current debate on defense. This is the first in years. And as a defense and security person, I think generally Canadians, and it's understandable, have not felt threatened. Pandemic notwithstanding, we have not felt threatened. With TikTok algorithms even being able to launch a massive attack on the country, I think we're now understanding it. And I think this is an opportunity. Sometimes you have to reach a crisis to transform it into an opportunity. So I think the other thing is that being a middle economy without really a playbook written for ourselves, the articulation of national interest is very important, because our words that we use on the international stage are important. And those words have to be reflected in every single strategy or policy document that the federal government puts out. They have to be the anchor. They have to outlive political change. And so those national interests, we have an opportunity with a wide debate on foreign affairs to articulate those interests. Now, why are words important? Because sometimes, especially our biggest ally to the south, can stand up, articulate some words in a statement, and then change their mind and do a 180 a week later. We cannot do that because we are not a big, powerful country like the United States is. So our words, we have to have our own words. We can't just copy other people's words. And this takes me back to being around the table with Canadians abroad and having very sensible ideas and very informed efforts being projected by that capacity. If we had some strategic level words to go with that capacity and knowledge and capability, then we would exert a much more powerful position internationally. So I would put just a vote down behind national interests. I would say there's an opportunity, especially with the debate around defense. We cannot afford to have a big conventional armed forces going forward. We have to think about niching a little bit. And lastly, I think that scenarios would help us understand those threats even more. Threats that happen on the other side of the world impact even the most remote community in this country. And let's see what they're going to extrapolate to in the future. Let's look at our trade situation. Let's see if we're going to be asked to leave the G7 one day soon and what that might mean to Canada. Let's see if we're going to be attacked in our Arctic, because all the land-sea trade routes that are the corridors that are being negotiated around at the moment are going to run into some problems, especially the one coming in by China through Azerbaijan to Europe. I sense that Europe is probably going to push back. The next corridor is the Arctic. Do we have an ocean governance framework in place to say, hang on, only these goods can come in, they come at this cost, that vessel's not allowed, that vessel's not allowed? No.
Thank you, Anne. And you all, this discussion was really insightful and thorough. And I think you all raised some really important points, which goes to our next question on the drivers of change. And Anne, you referenced this in your opening remarks when talking about things like human rights, supply chain, threat factors. So our next question, I'll direct this to Christina to hear your thoughts. As Anne mentioned, we've seen the global context really evolve. And some might argue that Canada's 21st century foreign policy has shifted from more values based to a more pragmatic and focused approach. So, from your perspective, what are the most pressing drivers of change that GAC needs to adjust to within this transformation agenda, and why should that specifically be addressed?
I think one of the drivers change is building up what Anne said, perhaps being more strategic, recognizing we can't be everywhere and something to everyone. And I know that the discussion paper outlined climate change and natural resources are one of the areas that Canada can and should be showing up. But when we compare GAC's foreign ministry spending per capita to some of our competitors in the natural resources area, for example, we fall short of a competitor like Australia. So I think it's important that not only we build the domestic expertise in these areas, but also that we have money to dedicate for not only how we show up, but also who is showing up. It's important to have both boots on the ground to work on those trading relationships with partners of interest on areas like critical minerals or liquid natural gas, hydrogen, what have you. But it's also important that Canada be showing up. And again, sometimes putting our money where our mouth is. To Anne's point again, I think there's always going to be multiple audiences for the government of Canada is speaking to when making various national statements or news conferences or whatnot. But I think a part of diplomacy is understanding how some actions play to domestic audience and also the impact it could have on international audience if we renege on some commitments.
Thanks, Christina. And Louise, also interested to hear if you have thoughts on that question, kind of within your experiences, and then we'll also hear from Antoine.
Sorry, unmuting is kind of like a challenge because it keeps
No worries.
disappearing. So I have to play a game with the button. Apologies for those seconds. I'm not sure I'm going to fully answer the question, but I just want to build on something Anna said and Christina said. There are many others at the table of foreign policy for Canada, and ones that we haven't and it came up when Christina was speaking. One of those are the provinces. You know, many provinces are very involved internationally, and they have jurisdiction that matter in Canada for our foreign policy. So it's making sure that we really leverage all of this. And so I think that some of the questions you'll be asking later, if you do, but you had them in the list, was financial constraints. I think when we work together, when we build on all, so stakeholders, civil society, population, and non-federal, subnational governments, I think we have a better fighting chance. But the other side to that is that sometimes we don't come on the world stage with a unified position. Sometimes we're at odds with certain premiers and provinces, objectives internationally. So that's a challenge for Canada, but I think it's one that's well worth the trouble. And I think what I've seen in my experience internationally, when it comes to particularly relationship with the United States, the provinces are integral to that. And I think we should take advantage of it and encourage it and continue to work closely with them.
Thank you, Louise. And Antoine, I think you had something to add here. And on the financial constraints question, we definitely will be getting to that in the future. But go ahead, Antoine.
Okay. Just also on that particular question, and certainly agreeing with what Louise said on the role of provinces and territories as a key actor of our overall presence. But going back and maybe building on what Christina said in her point, and indeed in the future of diplomacy on the discussion paper, we talk about climate and critical minerals and emerging tech and AI, and these are important as driving factors of in terms of our capacity to engage And so how do we organize ourselves? And I'm going to have a point on that. But for me, those points are important. The point in a way is how do we collectively, because only me and the team and the different leaders in the organization, we build a department that will be able to well in advance identify what's the next challenge. And now do we start right now to build some of those resources, the expertise and the networks and the partnerships and the collaboration to face the next challenge. I was at my alma mater just recently at Université Laval, and we had a conversation, and a colleague there mentioned that maybe water, for example, is one of the issue that is the next, it's already there. We already discussed that. As you look at some of the emerging themes that are driving the need for a more flexible and a more adjusted department to emerging themes and emerging challenges, the point for me is not only how we do better on those, but are we equipped to identify the next one and the next one and the next one? And do we have the reallocation and the staffing and the hiring capacity and the collaboration capacity to build that expertise well in advance of this issue bubbling up to the surface, while it might be too late to actually pre-position yourself or position yourself? And then going back to some of those issues, I'm going to use critical minerals in my past geographical remit, which is sub-Saharan Africa, a region where I had a chance to discuss with Anne quite a bit on different issues. But let me use Eastern DRC as an example. So critical mineral, we cannot have a conversation from a global affairs perspective if we don't talk about Eastern DRC. And Eastern DRC is not uniquely, it's actually not uniquely a trade perspective. It's actually a peace and security perspective. It's a foreign policy perspective. It's a development perspective. So going back to the resources, and I know that we'll have a chance to comment on the fiscal situation and what it means in terms of transformation perspective, but fundamentally, we need to make sure that we're equipped to bring all our tools to the table when we're trying to resolve an issue. And if you look at Eastern DRC as one example on the critical minerals front, is if we're not able to bring, which is not easy to do at Global Affairs, traditionally a siloed department, kind of with multiple kind of points of incentives, if we don't bring all our tools to the table in terms of critical minerals and Eastern DRC as one example, then we're not actually tapping into our collective expertise and our resources. So it's also an approach. It's not only the skills and competencies we have, but do we have the good approaches to bring all our tools to the table in a way irrespective of the financial envelope? And this is more of an organizational reflex, and we need to change that.
Thank you, Antoine. Which leads to the third question. Before we go, I think in the Q&A with participant, I've noticed a lot of questions popping in. And I do think it's an important one because it's related to financial constraint. So the question here is, in the context of economic limitation and budget cuts in the federal government, how can this ambitious transformation agenda be implemented? And maybe just to talk about Dylan's question, the impact on younger staff, for instance. So,
should I start? Do you want me to? Okay, and I'm sure the others would have used. So, of course, resources have an impact on our capacity, but as we navigated the June launch of the Future of Diplomacy discussion paper to the September launch of the implementation plan, and we're speaking grosso modo 6 months after the launch of the plan, those the fiscal context was getting clearer by the day, right, in terms of some of the changes. And then we had to have we reflected on it, including with the leadership of the organization, and kind of what does it mean in terms of our ambition. And the decision was, of course, we want to be pragmatic and realistic. There's some of the deliverables under the plan that might take a bit more time to advance, because some of them are more resource driven, financially driven, but we don't want to reduce our ambition in terms of the need for the change. So it's a question for me in terms of how do we sequence and adjust our timelines to meet our resource capacity? And that is also connected to, do we see transformation from a short game or long game perspective? And the reality is an organization where 14,000 colleagues deployed in so many different places with different streams and occupational groups, and we have rotational employees and traditional employees. I'm telling a story that many of you have known or experienced. It is changing the direction of that. I'm not talking about the foreign policy review, but just how the department approaches its mandate requires time. So if you look at it from a longer lens perspective, a longer game perspective, then some of those shorter term financial constraints you can mitigate that. You can mitigate the peaks and valleys of that. And the question is, how do we continue to create the culture of reallocation right now? So whenever there's a free dollar in our system, that we actually allocate those resources to transformational objectives. But that also requires transparency, including kind of with outside actors and internal stakeholders, and saying, yeah, kind of depending on where we are, some of the issues and the priorities will take a bit more time, and it's important to be transparent about that, and people get it. So I'm not too preoccupied, although I'm mindful of the impact of resources and the impact of the context, fiscal context. But I think it's important to keep the ambitions up. I think it's important and it's fundamental to the narrative of it. And the other part is, again, kind of I was mentioning in my intro remark, the sustainability of the change resides on the organizational culture. I do fundamentally believe that. And some of those elements in the first pillar of the implementation plan, the cultural organizational culture, these are elements that have very limited financial consequence. So this is why kind of if you look at it from the sustainability perspective, kind of the impact of finances might be actually less so. So important to keep in mind, important not to reduce our ambition, important to be transparent about some things that may need to change in time so that we can adjust our timelines vis-a-vis the resource availability. And I think we can do it in a way that doesn't have differentiated impact. Kind of, it's an important part of the equation is how we build a robust foreign service officer pool, which is one of the key deliverables both in the plan and in the Senate report. Kind of, we did significant hiring in our foreign service officer cadre, and this is where we can actually make sure that we mitigate the impact in our younger demographic. It's true that typically, kind of, we have some fragility, and our organizational structure is a bit precarious in terms of some of the lower level of the organization. But I think that if we can keep at it, keep growing the pool of rotational officer, allows for people in traditional position to have career development opportunity, we'll be able to mitigate against the risk that was raised in the question about undue or unbalanced impact towards the younger demographic of our department.
Thank you,
Maybe
Antoine. Louise, you can go.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think that's all right, absolutely. And also, I mean, one of the debates that have been, perennial for Global Affairs Canada is the HQ vis-a-vis abroad ratio. I mean, we've grown as an organization in Ottawa, and sometimes, and yet, if you speak to those who work at HQ Pearson Building in Ottawa and elsewhere, they will say that they are overworked and there's too much work. So I think I come back to the priorities. I think Antoine is right. I think we can ride and manage some of the fiscal landscape of today, but at the same time, I think there are things that we could do internally to maximize output. I think as part of the transformation, they're addressing red tape. I think that's critical. In my career that spanned about 25 years, I saw an enormous increase in the amount of procedural red tape that was put in place, all of it protective, all of it to make sure that no one does anything wrong but it doesn't manage risk very effectively, to be honest. And also, I was glad to see that in the transformation, there's talk about innovative ways of working. So, traveling ambassadors, everything is so bricks and mortar, and what's happened in the department over time, and as it was certainly true when I was there, and I don't know how it is today, it's been a few years, but all the back office has really grown in terms of its pie share of expenses and budget for the department. So everything from administration to property management to all of those processes, that seems that has grown at the expense of the actual work. So I think there is a lot of room there, I think, to garner some savings that can be reallocated internally still. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you. I will leave it to Eunice for the next question.
Thank you, Anya. And I think what we're going to do now is head over to our Q&A just in the interest of time. So a reminder to all participants that you can input questions through the Q&A function. So the first question I'm going to ask ties into somebody kind of talking about how to be considered to work in GAC and how to tie in their previous experiences into being able to enter into the department. So what should GAC be looking for when recruiting the next generation of foreign service officers, but then also just public servants within GAC in general? And how would you recommend somebody goes about that entrance? And maybe we'll go first to Louise or Antoine, just based off of your experiences, but then also Christina and Anne from your youth and student perspectives as well. So whoever is interested in starting off, you can go ahead. Christina, maybe I'll direct it to you first.
Sure. Well, I do not know exactly what GAC looks for foreign service officer recruitment specifically. Perhaps that is part of the issue. I think the transparency on who's moving forward through various steps of the application is not there. So it can leave a lot of folks who are interested in a career at GAC kind of left in the dust. And I'll share from my personal experience working at Global Affairs Canada. My first co-op position while a student at Carleton University was with the International Education Division, and I absolutely loved my 4 months there. But when it came for me to find my second co-op rotation, I interviewed at upwards of 8 GAC offices, and each of the managers, I asked about opportunities for bridging in to an indeterminate position following my co-op, and I didn't hear one success story from the managers or even anyone I was networking with at the time. So hearing that, I ended up accepting an offer at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, because at that time in my life, I was valuing job security and just an indeterminate entry into the public service rather than the subject matter and my passion for the file that Global Affairs was offering. So I think this is somewhere that HR is constantly aware of, how entry-level employees get into the department, but also I note that the discussion paper has noted opportunities for subject matter level expertise to come into the department on the areas that are of a priority to GAC, looking for more opportunities for folks already employed for the federal public service to come in. So it's something that's already being addressed, certainly slowly, but I hope surely as well.
And maybe I can jump in just on that, because there are multi points of challenges and opportunities as well. And some of our big entry competition in the kind of what we typically call the FS1, the foreign service officer entry level, they're huge competition. And there's that challenge of people understanding what how did they make it or not, and what was the rationale for that. So there's a set of processes and challenges that are attached to it. And I think we need to do a better job in terms of outreach. I think one of the issue is in the past 10, 12, 15 years, there was really lack of constant recruitment at all levels of the organization, and only in the foreign service officer rotational pool category, but broadly kind of in different occupational groups. And that were decisions that were made then that have still are handicapping us, are impacting us, because that also means that to go back to a normal rhythm, we need to do some of those big processes where people, and the bigger the process from an HR perspective, the more imperfection in terms of some of the results, and people don't. So I think that the more regular we become in terms of some of our competition at all levels, the better we'll be at having more precise and I think more adequate results as well, including for the participants will see themselves into that. I'm not pretending it's going to be perfect, but I think that increased rhythm will help. And in terms of the horizontal entry, I think this is something we're advancing in the thinking, but that's important. That was in the plan. That's also in the Senate report as well, and we need to go there. And this goes to I think Louise made the point, and maybe Anne and Christina. There's so many other government departments who are doing international work. And we need to be able to connect with them, not only in terms of how we drive policy, say on climate with ECCC as an example, or on innovation with ICED and so on, but we also need to integrate some of those horizontal deployment opportunity as part of a valued career path. And for the longest time in global affairs, the only outside place where you would go and feel valued about it was you go to PCO, Foreign Defense Policy Secretariat. That was part of a career path, and then you go back, and there was not that loin des yeux, loin du cœur feeling that when you it was just part of the career path. And the plan is as part of the transformation is actually to broaden that view as if we have people who want to go and work for 2 or 3 years in ECCC and vice versa for people from ECCC to come and work with global affairs and to other departments like heritage, like ISED and others, fisheries and ocean, we need to create those crosswalks as part of a career development process. So when you go, so that would also facilitate our capacity to do better policy, but also for people to have a chance to actually collaborate more horizontally on some key foreign policy issue. So that certainly is part of the plan. I don't think we've advanced dramatically on it, but for some of that horizontal crosswalks at mid-career, let's say, or other for people to come into global affairs and then to return to their home department or to stay in global affairs, this is something that's part of the radar screen. I think it's quite fundamental to the current market on international issues, which we're not the only game in town, and we need to be mindful of that.
Thank you, Antoine. We'll go to our next question now, which I will direct towards Louise and or Anne, as you both touched on things relating to Canada's national interests. So Adam in the Q&A says, thank you for the session. Louise mentioned the need to detach ourselves from virtue signaling to focus more on our national interests. So they're wondering if you could please expand on that with a concrete example. And this also ties into another question that was asked about what really is Canada's national interests and what is our interest in voice and where do we find a seat within the global context? So what is it that we're looking to transform in essence?
Great. Those are all very good questions, and they do blend well together. So I'm happy to try to give a stab at answering both. So I think that the exercise of looking at our interests has to be what is really in the interest of Canadians at any given time. And I would put forward that really there are two arching interests. One is security and one is prosperity. So one is about economic prosperity, which is a big driver in foreign policy today. And a lot of it is about Canada's ability to access market and to be able to attract investment. That's a big core part of foreign policy today. And it comes in large part, well, in part because now we're an amalgamated department and we have trade and we have development as part of it. So I think, and then security is first and foremost, our own security and that of our allies is a top interest for us. Now, after that, I mean, I'm not advocating that we neglect, human rights, the defense of human rights and the promotion of it, but I think it has to be recalibrated in a sense of where is it that we can actually make a difference? Where is our action actually going to advance those human rights that we're pushing forward? So I'm not saying that we should hide what our values are. We should be very proud of them, but we should be realistic as to whether at any country's ability to espouse them and to adopt them. And I think historically, and this is something, and we really felt it during the campaign for the UN Security Council. We were told quite a few times. I was in the room with our minister or with the prime minister, and we were told very politely to basically, and I'm going to be very blunt here, to buzz off. That part of the actions that we were doing from a development perspective was advancing values related to gender or to LGBTQ issues that were not welcomed by the government. They saw it as an interference into their own affairs. So that's just an extreme example. But I think Canada has to be mindful of, we're not a superpower, and Anne correctly pointed that out. There are things the United States get away with internationally and at the UN that is difficult for Canada to do. And so I think we just have to wait and see. If we push for this, it's all well and good, but if in return we're really going to make ourselves less secure, less prosper, then we have to really think about it. I think we have to be a little bit unapologetic about what was right for Canadians. And I think that has to come first. I think we wrote a paper, Anne and I consulted on it. It was written by Zach Pakin and we put forward the idea that for Canada, one of the areas of clear priority should be the Arctic. It speaks both to the environment and to our security. And so we cannot really get involved on every single issue around the world. And sometimes, and I'll end with this, I know we keep saying now that Canada's lost its influence around the world. I'm not so interested about having lost influence around the world. I think we shouldn't. I'm not sure that it was sustainable to keep the level of influence we did have. The world is changing. The global south is becoming much more militant, much more organized, and advocating for their position. And I think the UN has grown from the 50 plus members at its creation to 193. So obviously Canada's voice in those 193 is going to be somewhat lessened. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we have to have a little bit of humility how we engage internationally, a little less arrogance, and we have to really go back and look at our own geographic area. And I mentioned the Arctic, and I'll just close by saying, as well as I think the entire hemisphere. I think the Caribbean, Latin America, I think we really need to pay attention. I know now we're all focused on Asia Pacific, but I think there's a lot of very good reasons to say that we should be mindful of our own neighborhood. And so those are kind of just, it's difficult in one answer to give you the full, what should be in a book, but those are kind of the elements of what I was thinking about when I mentioned more closely tied to our interest.
Maybe I'll just add a few things on national interest. The first thing is we have disablers to a visionary long-term position. Chief amongst them are the electoral cycles, right? First year, you don't do much because you're scrambling around the new party, the candidate. Then you do things the next couple of years, and then it's an election year, so everything freezes. And, there are other countries around the world with whom we have to decouple and de-risk with that have long-term visions. And we have to better understand those models because they're very different to the Western construct around the electoral cycle. Why are national interests important? Because they're becoming their interests and values are sort of used and abused a little bit and have become very cliched, but they outlive political change. That's very important. And it's like a mathematical formula. This is the best way I tell some students to understand them. They are what is at the heart of Canadian society. So when you think of Canadianness, I find that we've lost our Canadian identity a little bit over the years. And national interest really helps define a Canadian identity because it's economic prosperity, it's security of our people, our borders, and our sovereignty. It is the protection of a favorable international order. Then we look at our environment that we're existing in and we say, how is that environment impacting on these things that we need to protect and defend and promote and pursue? And that equals, as the last part of the mathematical equation, the policy response. So it's the thing that we're trying to protect, it's the impact of the environment on those things, and therefore, what do we do about it? And what we do about it, the answer to the question should inform diplomacy, defense, economy, justice, etc. So that's why national interests are so important. And social fabric of the country is a very undervalued strength. And we need that social fabric to come back together again. I think over the years, Canada's strength has really been with assimilation. And we are losing that capacity to assimilate. We also need people in our country. But, diasporic politics is a big issue that a diverse country like Canada has to manage. And it's important that we have stable pillars that people subscribe to and sign up to when they become Canadian. And we always have had a process, and those pillars have to be strong because that's what has to lead our priorities and our policies. So I'm a big supporter of national interest, but I think that everybody has to have a conversation around. It has to be socialized in our educational establishments and, subject to good discussion.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for the Q&A. So we're going to wrap up, but we'll just give a very, very brief opportunity for any of the panelists that have a closing sentence or line or just a final word to wrap up the discussion. If not,
Yeah,
Antoine?
nothing for me. Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation.
Okay, awesome. So we'll just, Louise, go ahead. Nope, you're good. Okay. No worries. Okay, well, thank you to all of our panelists for providing us with such a great discussion, and I think you all came from it from really interesting and unique perspectives, which added a lot to what we had to discuss here today. And also a big thank you to our audience for joining and for your engagement and questions. This event was co-hosted by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy as well as Young Diplomats of Canada. So thank you to both teams. Just a note to our audience members that a video recording of this session will be posted on IPD's website and YouTube channel. So you can stay tuned to the Institute's social media channels for information on future roundtables and also to subscribe to our newsletters. As well, for young Canadians under the age of 30, you can keep an eye out to the Young Diplomats of Canada's social media channels for information on their recruitment cycles for those that are interested in participating in some of their upcoming youth delegations. So thank you once again to our panelists and audience members, and have a great evening.